welcome to Power Play on this Monday evening. I'm Vashi Capellos. Tonight, getting a boost.
This is not about getting to 2%, full stop. It's about defending Canada.
Prime Minister Mark Carney changes course on his own pledge and accelerates defense spending to hit 2% of GDP this year, 5 years ahead of schedule. Is the target really feasible? Canada's top soldier chief of defense staff, General Jenny Carignan, will join us in moments, and I'm going to ask her. Then, pipeline politics.
I'm saying that I'm going to convince David Eby of it because I know that this is good for the country.
We need a pipe. At the end of the day, if you wait till everybody agrees on everything, nothing will happen.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith makes waves after telling CTV News that she'll convince BC's Premier to move ahead with a pipeline to that province's coast, despite his vocal opposition to it. Alberta's NDP leader, Naheed Nenshi, who will be here live in studio in moments to give us his take on those comments. Plus, the front bench with Scott Reid, Shakir Chambers, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone will join us a little bit later on to talk about those pipeline politics and break down the impetus behind the federal government's promise to finally hit 2% of GDP on defense spending. That's coming up a little bit later on in the show. First, though.
Only one of our 4 submarines is seaworthy. Less than half our maritime fleet and land vehicles are operational. More broadly, we're too reliant on the United States. And so for all those reasons, I'm announcing today that Canada will achieve NATO's 2% of GDP target this year, half a decade ahead of schedule.
That's Prime Minister Mark Carney announcing a new timeline to increase defense spending and hit NATO's target 2% of GDP by this fiscal year. His announcement accelerates his own pledge made just a few months ago during the federal election campaign to hit that target by 2030. Back in 2014, Canada was among allies in NATO to agree to the target in the first place, which was to have been met by 2024. Until a year ago, Canada was the sole ally without a plan to get to 2%. Now, as mentioned, the feds intend to reach that 2% target by 2025-26. According to officials, that'll mean an additional $9.3 billion this year, rounding up in total to everything when you factor it into $62.7 billion. Speaking to reporters on Parliament Hill this afternoon, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre says his party supports the move, but still wants to see the details in a spring budget and make sure the numbers add up.
Now more than ever, we need a strong military that will reassert our sovereignty in the north, take back control of our Arctic waters. We need at least 1, but probably 2 Arctic bases. We need fighter jets, Poseidon aircraft. We need 4 and not 2 icebreakers. All of this is going to take money, and that's why we support getting back to the 2% target as soon as possible. And we will support additional money for our military. That's why we're calling on the government to bring in a budget, because all of this will require a budget.
For more on the pledge to hit 2% this year, we are joined live in studio by General Jenny Carignan. She is Canada's Chief of Defence Staff. Hello, General. It's good to see you. Thank you for coming back to studio. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Vashi. Great to be here.
I wanted to start off on the number itself, because for years we have been talking about the pledge to, the target itself, what it would mean for Canada's fiscal situation. The Parliamentary Budget Officer analyzed it would mean a doubling from $40 to more than $80 billion in order to meet the target. I know GDP forecast has shrunk, and therefore you don't need to spend as much to get to that percentage, but it's still $9 billion, not anywhere close to $40 billion in extra spending. Are we really all that ready with just $9 billion extra dollars?
So we are, Vashi, absolutely. And the numbers are inclusive of various other defense and security apparatus that we also need to consider as part of this number. So D&D and Canadian Armed Forces have the bulk of those increase in investments, but we are also including other investments within the Coast Guard, for example, CSIS and CSC as well. So we do have additional investments in those security organizations as well.
Is it, though, just kind of benefiting from in part at least, a shifting of numbers. For example, the Coast Guard that you bring up. During the technical briefing, we were told they would still fall under the Ministry of Fisheries, that it wouldn't involve arming the Coast Guard. And then later in the day, the Prime Minister's office said, oh, actually, it would be moving to the Department of National Defense. We don't have more clarity on whether or not they'd be armed. Like, are we just shifting the budget over in order to make the number?
So no, this is not creative accounting, if this is what we're talking about.
Correct, yeah.
Absolutely not. So this is really about providing us for what we need to actually affect defense for Canada and Canadians. So currently, and as per the past, and all NATO allies do the same thing, within defense spending, what you account for is there is clear NATO definitions to do that. And we have always accounted for the work that the Coast Guard has been doing, for example, in relation to defense and security in the maritime domain, as an example. So a portion of their budget was already accounted for within the defense budget, and so on and so forth. But within NATO, there are clear accounting measures and ways to define what goes towards defense, and we are absolutely going by that as well.
So at the end of the day, though, if I'm a Canadian watching who has been told, year after year that our armed forces are not getting their due, that they are not properly equipped, that they are not in size where they need to be, like, does this $9 billion of extra money make us ready for all of the threats that exist out there?
So this is a historical investment into our Canadian Armed Forces. I'm going to speak to that more specifically. It actually goes towards funding the foundation and of everything we are doing in terms of providing defense. So, for example, it's what we do on a daily basis. So it's funding for spare parts, maintenance, fuel, all of what we need to operate our equipment. And at the heart of that is our people. So everything we need to expand, recruit, and train new recruits. It's about housing and accommodation, both for our members, but also for training and infrastructure accommodations. It's at the heart of those investments is actually supporting our people in doing their job on a daily basis. So that mechanic needs a wrench to fix the airframes or the vehicles that we need to have ready on the line as we do our business on a daily basis. So a big portion of those investments go towards that.
And is this the amount of money that you, as the person who oversees all of those people, like, that you say will accomplish all of that?
Absolutely. So the plan and the program is actually built towards expanding and having the necessary people that we need right now, but also in the future for the new capabilities we will be onboarding.
So I want to ask about that more widely, because I think it speaks to the feasibility as well, right? I have interviewed countless ministers of defense over the years who have pushed back on me when I have asked questions about whether or not this was, why aren't we meeting this target? And they have talked about feasibility and issues around actually building the capacity necessary in order to spend that money. And all of our viewers will be familiar, for example, with the issues around procurement. But even when we get to the issue of recruitment, there's a whole new portal that was set up for it that had major issues. Anecdotally, we heard of people who had applied through that portal and had not heard a response for a couple of months. Is it actually feasible that the money that the Prime Minister is promising gets spent to do the things you and he say will get done will actually happen?
So in recruiting, for example, we have made significant changes to a broad range of our processes, but also methodologies, and as well as digital platforms to support what we are doing. So as we onboard new platforms, we are working through initial challenges, but the more time goes, the more we actually improve on that. And so do we on the process aspect. So this year, for example, we have, for the first time in 10 years, surpassed our target by 200. And for the first time, again, in 10 years, we have finished overall for the Canadian Armed Forces by 2,000. So this is a huge success into our recruiting and retention efforts as well, because both go together. And then this year, we will be increasing our recruiting targets, and we will keep improving the new methods and the new initiatives that we have implemented.
Do you need to, I take your point on accelerating, but do you need to even revisit that level of acceleration, given the goals and the targets as outlined by yourself and the Prime Minister today? Yes, you've beat your target, but those targets are incremental in nature, and you're still, I think, 13,000 people short of where you need to be, correct?
So what we have been doing, so since the announcement of the increased investment at the last NATO summit, we have crafted a way forward on the plan to reach 2%. So we basically formulated various options for government, and one of them was, of course, to get to GDP, to the 2% investment faster, and so on and so forth. So those options were considered, but also knowing that it is clear that this is why my priority number one was the recruiting aspect in sorting that space to ensure that we could again accelerate the recovery of our numbers back to their full strength, but also onboard supplementary people to ensure that we can crew the new capabilities that will be coming on board.
Again, I guess that goes to my question around feasibility, though. Like, how soon do you expect to be at full capacity? Because recruitment has been, and I'm not trying to take away from the success you've had, let's say, in the last year, but it has dogged the armed forces for more than a decade.
So again, the results we've had this year are encouraging, so we will be continuing to improve what works. We will correct what doesn't work so well, so that we will keep expanding faster. So we are not going to, we can do both at the same time, because we have to onboard new people for new capabilities, but we also have to go back to full strength. So we are doing both at the same time.
Do you agree with the Prime Minister that Canada has been too reliant from a defense perspective on the United States?
We have been reliant on like collectively on multilateralism to exercise collective defense. So Canada historically has relied on multilateralism for its defense. And it is absolutely true that the threat has changed out there. I think Canadians are very well aware of that. And that our geography does not protect us as well as it used to in the past. So whether it's multilateral organizations such as NATO or with the United States as part of NORAD, it is clear that in this changing world, and again, we need to take part of this and then make it our own to make sure that we can actually defend Canadians and Canada.
The Prime Minister, with respect, was very specific about being too reliant on the United States. The pressure has come very specifically also from this U.S. president for us to spend more on defense. Do you think that this accelerated timeline would have been released now without that pressure?
I can't really stipulate as what would have been.
You've been involved in talks, though. I know you said on this program months ago that you were lobbying for a faster effort to get to this target.
We need to go faster based on what we observe on the threat as well in the global environment. And of course, with the new U.S. administration, there is a shift in policies as well. So we have to respond to that and adapt to the new reality that we are facing.
I wanted to conclude and ask about that overall threat environment from your perspective, because you have access to a lot of things that we do not, a lot of information that we do not. Today, the head of NATO, Mark Rutte, said Russia could be ready to use military force against NATO within 5 years. Do you agree with that assessment?
This is the general assessment that we make, and then this is done looking at how fast Russia could reconstitute its forces based on its defense industrial base and on the various technologies that they have developed up to now. So this is definitely the estimate that we are using to get ourselves ready, which is why there is a sense of urgency behind what we are currently doing in increasing investments in defense.
And will we have to increase them even further? Mr. Rutte today said that the goal for NATO allies will likely be 3.5%.
So for us, and personally for me, what's important is that I build a plan to go after the capabilities that we need. So this is how I'm approaching it. Where that falls in the percentage GDP spending is not for me to decide, but my job is really to paint the picture as to what kind of capabilities, how many people, and what we need to affect the defense.
Does it make sense to you, though, that there would need to be, given the threat environment that you're very aware of, there would need to be more aggressive capability increases and spending increases than is currently the case?
So we need to be structured and equipped differently, because what we've been asked to do for the past 35 years is fundamentally different than what we are being asked to do from now and going forward. So capabilities that we didn't need in the past, such as air defense, because we had air supremacy, that we spent less time and money on that particular capability. And this is just one example. But of course, air defense system, sensors for all domains, like from space, air, and maritime, underwater.
Does that include the Golden Dome?
It includes, again, having the capability to detect what could come towards our territory and what could affect our sovereignty. And then once it's detected, you have to have the capability to intercept what's coming at us.
That sounds like the Golden Dome.
Well, for us, it's the defense of Canada, yes.
And just very quickly, before I let you go, General, final question. What is the biggest threat, security threat, facing Canada right now?
The biggest threat is the convergence of many of them coming together. So it is really the efforts of many security apparatus within our whole of government that is going to do the job per se. So it's the convergence of many things at the same time. It's misinformation as much as missiles, as much as air, as much as underwater. It is a very complex threat, and this is why we need everybody to get together and work at this.
I will leave it on that note. General Carignan, I appreciate you making the time for the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vashi.
General Jenny Carignan is the Chief of Defense Staff for the Canadian Armed Forces. Coming up, we'll take a quick break. After that break, conflict over consensus. Prime Minister Mark Carney says consensus is a necessary condition of moving forward with nation-building projects. Well, Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith tells us she can get BC's Premier on board for a new pipeline. Alberta's NDP leader, Naheed Nenshi, will be my next guest after a short break. Stay right there.
I'm saying that I'm going to convince David Eby of it, because I know that this is good for the country. I know that he's on Team Canada, and I can't imagine in the end that if we meet the issues that have been raised by British Columbia, that he would go off Team Canada. That doesn't seem to me to be the type of person that David Eby is. I think there's some concerns we have to address. We have to have a proponent. We have to make sure that we have a route. We've got to make sure we've got Indigenous buy-in. But in the end, I mean, we did get 2 pipelines built to the coast. We got the Trans Mountain pipeline built. We got the Coastal Gas Link built. That was under a more hostile federal government. And I think that it's because we addressed the objections. And that's our job. We're going to make sure that we address the objections, and we're going to get it built.
Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith there on CTV's Question Period over the weekend, saying she intends to convince BC Premier David Eby to support building a pipeline from Alberta through BC to Tidewater, despite Eby already voicing opposition. Her latest comments come as the feds and provinces look to collaborate on so-called nation-building projects, but the Prime Minister says those projects will require consensus to go ahead. CTV News asked Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre about that this afternoon, whether he thinks consensus is needed. Here's his response.
No, we've got to get it done. We need a pipe. At the end of the day, if you wait till everybody agrees on everything, nothing will happen. You're never going to get everybody to agree. on every single project. We have to get things done, and it's going to take some backbone. And so we as Conservatives believe in pushing ahead with pipelines, and the shortest route is to the Pacific. Any other route is going to be even harder politically and physically.
Alberta's NDP leader, Naheed Nenshi, is live with us in studio for more on all of this. Hi, Mr. Nenshi. It's good to see you.
It's so great to be with you, Vashti.
I appreciate you making the time. I wanted to start off on the point where Mr. Poilievre left off. Essentially, he's saying that it just needs to get done. Consensus can't be a precondition. Do you believe consensus is necessary?
No, I think Mr. Poilievre is right on this one. When I think about the work we did to get the Trans Mountain expansion built, it required a lot of work. And I'll remind folks that happened with the New Democrat government in place in Alberta, with the federal government. And I have to say, over the objections of the Premier of British Columbia at the time. It was the right thing to do. It's propping up our economy right now in the face of Trump tariffs. And so I'm not suggesting you run roughshod over people. You have to have consultation with Indigenous groups, with people, landowners across the way. But eventually you have to make a decision. And sometimes consensus can be an excuse to not get anything done. So we've heard a lot from this Prime Minister about the need to build these nation-building projects, the need for Canada to build again, which is terrific. We want to hear that kind of language. We also have to understand that there's a lot that needs to happen to get this stuff done. You need a federal government and regulatory processes that work. You need a provincial government that's willing to put its shoulder to the wheel to get stuff done. You need a proponent who's willing to put forth the money and do the consultation. And you need customers. You need suppliers and customers. So all of this has to come together, as it did with Trans Mountain. But it's a lot of hard work. And the more barriers we can remove, the better. But we also have to understand that we don't get there just through bullying. And, the Premier has said she will convince David Eby. Well, how is she going to convince him when she insults him and says he's not part of Team Canada? Of all people to say you're not part of Team Canada, that's pretty rich coming from my Premier. But we've got to be able to do these negotiations in a thoughtful way so that people can see the advantage both for themselves and for the nation as a whole.
To be fair, I think, she was making the case she said, she wanted to try and convince him, and that she ultimately believed he would want to be a part of Team Canada, that he would not want to stand in opposition to a project that she viewed as nation building. What's wrong with that?
It's okay, but when you take it in the context of who Danielle Smith is and how she's approached negotiations in the past, she's very rarely looking for a win-win. I keep wanting to buy her a copy of Trump's The Art of the Deal in the hopes that she can get there a little bit more. And here's the real problem. Is I don't think that the Premier of Alberta is doing a great job on talking about what's good for Canada, what's good for the whole nation. On the show this weekend, she said Canada had the lowest living standards in the world, which is ludicrous. It's a garbage thing to say. But it really is indicative of talking down Canada and talking down Alberta. And this is dangerous stuff, because it's not just about the importance of getting national infrastructure built, which we have done when we can work together, but it's also stoking the very real fires of Alberta separatism. And look, we're going to have, unless the courts intervene or there is a snap election in Alberta that Danielle Smith loses, hopefully to me, we will have a separation referendum in Alberta next summer. That's been promised. How in the world can we not derail all of our progress as a nation when we're doing this work? This is very real. It's very serious. And Danielle Smith continues to pour fuel on that flame in the hopes that she can control it. And I'm not convinced she can.
Might it be that she and her supporters feel the approach that you're advocating for, one, for example, embodied by former Premier Rachel Notley, doesn't actually get where you and your supporters would claim it gets people? Yes, TMX was ultimately built, but that was at a great cost to taxpayers across the country. And ultimately, other pipelines that people in your province did want to see built, like Northern Gateway, like Energy East, did not. And they felt, at least as they are conveying it to us, that they were sold this pitch from your party that if they agreed to all this stuff on climate, that we would see pipelines and more export capacity built out. And that simply didn't happen to the degree that the Premier at the time had promised. So maybe they're looking at a different tack. Maybe they don't want to be so nice.
Massive shift in goalposts here, right? Because let's keep in mind that Conservative governments in Alberta, as well as federally, over 40 years have built precisely 0 meters of pipeline to Tidewater. We got one built. And the point is, sure, we need lots more export capacity. I've always been a fan of that. But the UCP, Danielle Smith and her government, have been in power for 6 years, and they have not advanced one single proposal for a pipeline. Now, don't get me wrong, the Environmental Assessment Act is a mess. And it was a mess before. So the example I always use, getting away from pipelines, is we finally have operational this spring a dry dam outside of Calgary to protect from floods. That's 12 years after the flood. And of those 12 years, 5 to 6 years were taken up in a never-ending federal environmental assessment process that was under the Harper era rules. And what was called Bill C-69 makes it even harder. So we need the federal government to actually make a commitment to get stuff built and to make sure that we can get through this. I'm super excited about the one window in the 2 years if it can be done. But those conditions are necessary, not sufficient. The thing about the Conservatives in Alberta, and particularly Danielle Smith, is they love to fight, but they hate to win. They don't actually want to make deals. They want to have something to fight about. As for me, I prefer to make deals. I don't pick fights, I win them.
But what if you make the deal and it doesn't end up benefiting Albertans to the degree that you want it? Like, that's my point. I think that there is a sense among Danielle Smith's supporters that playing nice and cooperating with the federal government does not lead you down some path of, great abound for Alberta. And they certainly feel let down. And I think, the election outcome for Rachel Notley is part and parcel of that.
Well, I will quote Danielle Smith on your show when she said 100% of zero is zero. So you can fight all you want, but you're not getting anything done. And so the point is, you got to get stuff built. And the way that she's approaching this isn't getting anything built. As I said, they haven't advanced 1 meter of pipeline since Jason Kenney took power in 2019. And so what we need to see is a different approach, not just from the federal government, which is vital, but we need a different approach from the provincial government as well that actually gets stuff done.
And what do you think that the federal government, I take your point on the provincial government, but you mentioned C-69. There are, the emissions cap and C-69, both of which, Scott Moe and Danielle Smith, Premier Smith and Premier Moe, as well as the industry, are saying need to be repealed or need to be moved away from the adjudicating process in order for the stuff to go forward. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I was opposed to 69 from the beginning. But here's the issue. When parts of Bill C-69 were deemed unconstitutional, I would have seen that as a real opportunity to go to the federal government and say, here is what would work. We're not saying there should be no environmental assessment. It's crucial to get projects done. But, back to the dam. We were getting asked questions like, what would the impact be on the trout in a 1 in 100-year flood with and without the dam? The trout would probably die. But they're not an endangered species, and that shouldn't make a difference to whether or not you say yes to this critical piece of infrastructure.
But who's saying no to any environmental assessment, to be clear? I've never heard the province say that.
I would have suggested that the Premier could have gone, or Scott Moe could have gone to the feds and said, here is a unified assessment that we could live with the province and the feds working together. Instead, they waited for the feds to come up with something else that they then took to court again. It's all really counterproductive. I believe that we can easily create a system that people can be happy with if folks are willing to give up power and also agree that we need to do this as a nation. And I'm just not seeing that happening on a bilateral space between the feds and the provinces right now.
Are you sure of that? Because I remember talking to those premiers frequently during that time, and I don't remember, to be fair, like any of them saying there shouldn't be an environmental assessment, for example.
No, sorry, don't misunderstand me. None of them are saying that, but none of them, well, I shouldn't say none of them. My Premier, let's talk about Alberta. My Premier has not come to the table with a process that we think would be a good process. We've just simply been saying we hate C-69. And I feel like we're now at the point as a nation, especially with a new government in place federally, where we should be able to get beyond we hate and get to here's what would work.
Okay, I got to leave it on that note. Mr. Nenshi, thanks very much for coming in.
It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. Naheed Nenshi is the leader of the Alberta NDP. We'll take another quick break. On the other end of that break tonight on Power Play, back to our top story. The Prime Minister is pledging to hit that NATO defense spending target this year instead of 5 years from now. Our front bench with Scott Reed, Shakir Chambers, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone. We'll talk about the impetus behind that next.
The United States is beginning to monetize its hegemony, charging for access to its markets and reducing its relative contribution to our collective security. In parallel, the world's trade routes, allegiances, energy systems, and even intelligence itself are being rewired. Rising great powers are now in strategic competition with America. A new imperialism threatens. Middle powers must compete for interests and attention, knowing that if they're not at the table, they're on the menu.
Prime Minister Mark Carney there making the announcement to increase defense spending to 2% of GDP this year, 5 years ahead of schedule. In his remarks, he highlighted the United States, as you heard there, in its shifting role on the world stage. He also committed to reducing Canada's reliance on the Americans when it comes to defense. The major policy announcement comes just a week before the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta. And today we learned that Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has accepted an invitation to attend. Let's bring in the front bench to talk about all of that. CTV News political commentator Scott Reed is here. He's former communications director to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Shakir Chambers is a vice president at Oyster Group. He worked in Prime Minister Stephen Harper's office before becoming a policy advisor to the International Trade Minister. Kathleen Monk is former director of communications to the late Jack Layton. She's now the principal owner of Monk & Associates. And Laura Stone rounds us out tonight. She's a Queen's Park reporter for the Globe and Mail. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you on this Monday evening. Scott, I'll start with you. What do you think the impetus strategically was for this announcement right now?
I think three things. Certainly the G7, second, the NATO summit that's coming up. But I think also there is the possibility that this is also triggered by ongoing discussions with the United States. All of these things seem to be demands upon the public purse in terms of more defense spending from Canada. And I would just say this, there is a climate crisis. There is a consensus, suddenly it seems, in the country to do big things and do them quickly. But boy, oh boy, Mark Carney campaigned as a leadership candidate and then as a prime minister in terms of moving up our defense spending. But to add $9 billion in 1 year, that is a big deal, to level up in that fashion. So to me, there is something going on here. It is either that Mark Carney has come to the conclusion that the only way to compete on the world stage, to do our bit and to manage our way in the G7 and NATO is to do this, and or he's come to the conclusion this is a necessary precondition for a trade and security deal with the United States. It could be both things. It might be neither. I don't know. But you don't spend $9 billion ad infinitum for nothing.
Yeah, and I think in particular, when you contrast that, Shakir, to many opportunities during the federal election campaign to say, we'll do it by 2027, 2028, and they had a very specific date picked out, right, at 2030. My guess is it's a little bit of column A, as Scott lays out, and a little bit of column B.
Yeah, I would agree. I do think Scott is bang on. I mean, we read the reports of Carney and Trump having, secret talks about an agreement about security and defense. I think getting to that 2% easily gives Trump that kind of win that he always wants to say that, through me, Canada is finally meeting its NATO targets, and we can move forward in defending and, providing some kind of economic relief to Canada. But I also think the NATO Leaders Summit is a bigger thing. I think the timing is not ironic here. I think ultimately Carney knows the naming and shaming that comes along with Canada being at these events. And for all intents and purposes, he is new in that chair. And I think, you only get one chance to make a first impression. I think he wants to make a really good impression to a lot of the NATO leaders. I would say this, though. I mean, even increasing it by $9 billion, I think we all know on this panel, D&D obviously has a lot of issues, kind of filling out its existing budget. And so it's going to be very challenging to get the cash out the door. But I would also say for anyone who's actually dealt with the military procurement, defense procurement bureaucrats and public servants, great people, but they are very process driven. I think for Mark Carney, he wants to do a 180 and move at a pace they're not used to or not accustomed to moving at. And I think all it's really going to take is one mistake or one error for them to go back to their default position and put more and more process in the way and not go at the pace that Mark Carney wants to see. So kudos to him for having this ambition and having this drive. But I'm just not sure whether it's Parliament itself or the actual public servants are built to move at this pace that he wants to see.
it's interesting the way Shakir put it. It's almost another test case, Kathleen, for something we've been talking about on repeat since the election, which is basically like articulating this very specific ambition that we have not seen in a long time up against how do you make it happen and the sort of like what realistically exists to stand in the way.
Yeah, and the challenge that's existed for so long in the Department of Defense and that we've seen come up time and time again at Defense Committee is their inability to spend. So I actually think that the Carney government has come up with a clever solution, an elegant solution really to that, that they are dealing with, in fact, the Trump crisis and the tariff crisis by at the same time dealing with a crisis that has existed in Canada for a long time, which is the incredible shortage in the CAFF. I apologize if you hear that sound in the background. I had a power outage and then everything has just turned on, including my very loud TV. But
we're happy the power is back. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just continue on. Hopefully you can't hear it. But I do think that he's addressing a long-term crisis that's existed in Canada. That's being the massive shortage, the failure to pay our troops and the CAF appropriately, and provide them the equipment that is required. And today's announcement is going to address much of that, and that's what's so critical. And I'll go.
The math will, I hope you're watching CTV in the background. I hope that's what just popped up. The math will also be interesting, and I know that the Prime Minister was like, not for today, that's for the fall when a budget comes in. But these are stacking up to be, very expensive promises, not just today, but other ones that have been made. At a time when he's also saying he'll cut on operating spending and achieve certain results there. And today he was asked how that's going to happen. Again, he was like, the numbers are coming later on in the fall.
I do enjoy how Prime Minister Carney bats down questions at press conference, just saying, we're not talking about that today. That might get a little bit old pretty quickly. But look, I mean, clearly, Prime Minister Carney is making very ambitious and expensive promises, and he has to fulfill those at some point, right? He's talked about these nation-building projects with the premiers getting that going. He's just snapped his fingers and decided he's going to spend $9 billion more in defense. I think Scott's absolutely right that it appears to be tracking towards some sort of deal with the United States. And there's probably, if that does happen, a tremendous amount of goodwill among the public if he's able to do that. But you only have so long with the public, so much goodwill with Canadians, several months probably before they expect results. And so the chickens are going to come home to roost when we get a look at the books, when we see that budget, when we see how they're going to pay for all of this. Are people going to get fired? He says they're not. How are they going to cut spending? What kind of programs are on the chopping block? We don't know. So I think the announcements like today leave a lot of unanswered questions, and he may not have to answer them today, but at some point the Prime Minister is going to have to provide a more detailed spending plan to Canadians.
Okay, I got to take a quick break. On the other end of that break, we've got more to talk about pipeline politics. Can Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, convince BC's Premier to build a pipeline through his province to Tidewater? We'll talk about that next with our front bench.
I'm saying that I'm going to convince David Eby of it because I know that this is good for the country. I know that he's on Team Canada, and I can't imagine in the end that if we meet the issues that have been raised by British Columbia, that he would go off Team Canada. That doesn't seem to me to be the type of person that David Eby is.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith there on CTV's Question Period over the weekend, saying she intends to convince BC's Premier David Eby to support building a pipeline from Alberta through BC to Tidewater, despite Eby already saying he doesn't want one. Ontario Premier Doug Ford and Nova Scotia Premier Tim Houston were asked about Smith's comments at a fireside chat in Toronto by the lovely Laura Stone, and here's how they responded.
Should they be able to kind of veto a province's objections?
I wouldn't say so. I'd rather work collaboratively and work in cooperation.
If we get to a point where the vast majority of the country wants something and knows it has to happen, then we can't let something stop that. And I would expect that the government of Canada would step up and step in. But I don't think we're there yet. But I think that we can't lose sight of where we're trying to get and where we need to get to as a country.
Let's bring back the front bench to talk about that. Scott Reed, Shakir Chambers, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone. Laura, I will start with you because you posed the question at that event hosted by the Globe and Mail. What is your sense of, how this might kind of unfold?
Well, look, I mean, clearly Premier Ford and Premier Houston are in favor of a pipeline, and they're on Team Danielle Smith on this one. I think, Premier Ford took a diplomatic approach there, saying he hopes that provinces can work together and collaborate. And then in the next breath, he talked about going to Alberta to visit Premier Smith. He says he's going to be promoting a pipeline out there, and he makes the case quite strongly for it. So I think this is going to be a matter of peer pressure among the provinces and the premiers to get this done. I think that's a long way down the road, however, as Premier Houston mentioned there. I don't think we're going to be having Prime Minister Carney kind of dictating that there needs to be a pipeline. I think what he's done and where he's making room is making a case within the business community to pitch one. And that's where Premier Smith is probably a bit happier than she was under the previous Liberal government, that she'll be able to find the space to do that. But this has the potential to get quite ugly. And I don't think Prime Minister Carney wants to be vetoing or dictating to any province what they should or shouldn't do. I think he wants everyone to come together. So this is one to watch, but I think it's going to be a matter of power and numbers among the premiers of how they can convince one another to build these so-called nation-building projects.
Yeah, I think it's a fair statement, Kathleen, that the Prime Minister doesn't want to have to say this is going to happen against a province's will. But I think that the way that we're hearing comments from Premier Eby and Premier Smith certainly leaves open the possibility that ultimately the feds would have to make some kind of decision, either not to or to.
Well, first, a couple things. Like, Premier Eby has been acting as the West Coast version of Captain Canada. He has been looking for new markets. He has been leading, as the other premiers have, in terms of trying to find new ways for Canada to support itself in the light of the tariff, conflict and crisis. He's right now in Japan doing a trade mission right now to find those new markets. So the accusation of him not playing on Team Canada falls pretty flat. And then let's go back to the facts on the actual pipeline. I mean, there is no proponent for this pipeline right now. There are no investors for this pipeline right now. And in fact, we saw the BC Energy Minister, in Alberta in the last few days, voicing support, frankly, for Calgary's energy industry and saying, hey, we're willing to boost pipeline capacity. We're helping, we can think of creative ways of doing that, getting additives in there to move oil quicker and faster. So there are ways that are more practical, more pragmatic, frankly, and will still help.
The power went out again, unfortunately. We lost Kathleen for a moment, but I'll swing over to Shakir and get your take. And I understand, the practical argument that's being made, right? There is no proponent. That is a fact. But there might be if the conditions allow for it. And I think also, Shakir, the idea is not just to expand capacity that exists. It's to build out brand new capacity. I don't know how you ever get everyone on the same page around that, because they haven't been in the past.
Yeah, I think at some point for the Prime Minister, the rubber's going to hit the road. Since he's got elected and he's chose his cabinet, there's been a lot of good rhetoric and a lot of good talk to folks in Alberta and folks in Calgary about, supporting pipeline and then the movement of their product to Tidewater. And so I think at some point, if Premier Eby's opposition is just strictly ideological, and I don't want a pipeline because I just don't want a pipeline, I think that's going to be unacceptable, and Prime Minister Carney might have to step in. But if there's criteria that needs to be fulfilled, and Premier Smith and whoever the proponents are can fulfill that criteria, I think it just makes sense to move this forward. I think I would say this. I saw Laura's interview. Ford was very diplomatic. But last week when you were covering the First Minister's meeting, Vashi, I noticed that none of the premiers outside of Ford and Mo would actually publicly support a pipeline. Everybody else, when asked, was like, oh, there's no one there. There's no proponent there. We need to review this. We need to review that. So I am kind of skeptical about, even behind closed doors, how many of these premiers are actually supporting Smith and moving this forward. I think if you don't have that critical mass behind closed doors, that gives Mark Carney a way to kind of back out of it. But if there are premiers who are just, kind of camera shy or worried about their constituents in their province, getting upset about them backing a pipeline, I get that. But if you can have that critical mass behind closed doors, I think Prime Minister Carney needs to show some leadership and get that project built.
Kathleen has rejoined us, so I'll give her, let her finish her thought, and then Scott, I'll give you the concluding word. Kathleen, over to you.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Clearly, I need more energy at my house. So if anyone wants to create a pipeline over here for an energy infrastructure project, I'll take it. Listen, I just think that there's more practical and pragmatic ways, and the BC government is suggesting them. In fact, I don't know where I dropped off, but their energy minister, Adrian Dix, was in Calgary proposing ways to get more of Calgary, Alberta's gas and energy and oil through to the coast. So I think that there are things to consider before that. Listen, there's going to be a lot of competition for projects, for these, national interest, big projects. And I don't think we need to stay focused just on pipelines. There's Wind West from the east. There's things that Ontario and Quebec want to do as well. There's the Port of Churchill. I think that we need to think what project is the best and has the most benefit for all Canadians.
Yeah, I think, and certainly whenever I interview someone from the federal government, Scott, that's what they say to me. Like, look at this long list of projects that we like that can go ahead. But those aren't ones that have proven to be controversial, which is why I think often, like I, for one, ask about, because we saw the way previous governments navigated that, for right, for wrong, whatever you want to say. And so it's sort of like a test case to figure out how they're going to.
Yeah, well, I do think, watch the Port of Churchill, because I think there might be a lot of quiet momentum behind that possibility as an alternative option. But beyond that, I mean, there's an irony here, which is that the reason Mark Carney said we will not trample over the expressed concerns of any individual province, that was in deference to Alberta's political concerns during the leadership campaign and that weird environment we had during the winter when Danielle Smith was saying, well, my God, we can't possibly have this net zero communist as our prime minister. And now, of course, she's picking up the mantle and saying, I'll be the delegate of saying, let's overwhelm the objection on the part of BC. And sending Danielle Smith to British Columbia to convince David Eby to go with a pipe. It's like sending me to Australia to convince Kate Blanchett to marry me. It is a fool's errand. It will not work. Incentives will be the only thing that unlock this. If something happens in British Columbia to get out that way, as opposed to having to reroute and take the Port of Churchill, it'll be because there are sufficient incentives and sufficient reassurances to the province of British Columbia to allow it to happen. But this is all going to happen fast because public consensus will evaporate and public pressure will ease. So the Prime Minister's going to make this happen. He can't rely on Danielle Smith, and he's going to have to put some big, big, big carrots on the table for David Eby.
I look forward to attending the wedding of Scott Reid and Kate Blanchett. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to our front bench. It'll be a good party. Yeah, Scott Reid, Shakir Chambers, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone, our front bench. We'll take a quick break. More Power Play just ahead. Welcome back to Power Play. Some more tonight on our top story. The federal government announcing that they will accelerate the timeline to meet the NATO defense spending target. Instead of reaching 2% of GDP on defense spending by 2030, as promised by the Liberals during the election campaign, they now say they are in a position to meet that through about $9 billion of extra spending this fiscal year. But even that might not be enough. Here is the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte.
It is vital that every member of NATO pulls their weight, because America has carried too much of the burden for too long. America's allies have broad shoulders, and Europe and Canada will do more for our shared security. And that will be backed by America's rock-solid commitment to NATO.
So NATO leadership intends to push for a new target for allies on defense spending as a portion of GDP. Not 2% that Canada just today said we will meet this fiscal year, but 3.5% of GDP, which is substantially higher. I'm going to leave Power Play there. I'm Vashi Kapelos. Thank you so much for watching this evening. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a good night.